Good morning, everyone. Thanks for thank you. Thanks for coming out, and thanks to CalMatters for facilitating these important conversations today. I'm Don Howard, and I have the privilege of being president and CEO of the James Irvine Foundation. Welcome to our offices. We're a privately endowed foundation, independent of any company or family, and we focus entirely on California. Our singular goal is a California where all low-income workers have the power to advance economically. This year, we'll provide about $158 million in grants toward that goal, including to CalMatters, a great partner, by the way. I want to talk briefly today about something that's already reshaping California's workforce, not in some distant future, but right now, artificial intelligence. There is no doubt that AI is enabling efficiencies in the workplace. But at the same time, many workers are training AI systems that could eventually de-skill, displace, and surveil them, often without any say in how these tools are being developed or deployed. This issue goes beyond technology. It's fundamentally about power. Who decides how AI gets utilized in our workplaces, and who benefits from these changes? Right now, the AI revolution is happening to workers, not with them. And as almost always happens with rapid change, low-wage workers are the most vulnerable. We're in a critical window of opportunity right now. AI governance frameworks are still being developed. Corporate practices aren't yet entrenched. Conversations like these today can help us better understand the impacts on workers and develop solutions that shift power and agency to them before it's too late. Our grantees at Irvine are taking advantage of this moment to prepare California workers for an AI-driven future. Let me share a few examples of what's happening on the ground. The National Domestic Workers Alliance has developed a chatbot called La Alianza that shares resources with Spanish-speaking domestic workers. The tool also gives NDWA real-time insights into changing worker priorities, which then informs their organizing. It's technology that serves movement building, not surveillance. The Tech Equity Collaborative is building a diverse coalition, civil rights groups, labor unions, and housing advocates to create responsible AI governance right here in California. They're working to counterbalance the tech industry's influence and ensure that AI policies protect vulnerable populations. And the UC Berkeley Labor Center is leading statewide education for worker organizations about AI and technology policy, helping them understand new worker rights under the California Consumer Privacy Act. California has always led on worker rights. Now we have the chance to show the nation what it looks like when workers have a voice in shaping our AI future. And the stakes couldn't be higher. AI can either shrink economic inequality or dramatically widen it. The choice is ours. I'm eager to hear from our speakers today about the impacts of AI and automation in the workplace, especially on low-wage workers, and what their recommendations are for ensuring worker power and agency in the age of AI. So let's jump in. Over to you, Neil.
Don, thank you. Thank you for hosting us today. Thank you for being a great partner. CalMatters turned 10 years old last week, and I know I look a little older. And I'll tell a story Don told me. When our founders went around to a bunch of folks and said, we want to do this thing, a lot of them couldn't quite get their heads around it. And I think, Don, you said, it's a great idea, we really need it. I can't imagine how they'll pull it off, but sure, we'll help. And you did. You were one of the first supporters, and it has helped thanks to you and a lot of other folks. If you don't know us, CalMatters is a nonprofit, nonpartisan journalism organization in the same way that Don described the James Irvine Foundation as being independent and focused on California. That's us. And we started 10 years ago with 6 people. We now have 80 all over the state, a number of whom you're going to meet today. Everybody who's here from the team has staff written on their name tags. Feel free to introduce yourself and say hello. And what we are doing with these events is trying to take the stories we do and bring them into a room full of people and a Zoom full of people. Welcome to everybody who's here online. There are more people online than the number of people in the room. Great to see people in both venues. bring the conversation into a room full of people who care about these issues, who want to learn about these issues, who want to talk about them. I'm super excited today that we have members of the state legislature, we have local electeds here, we have folks from philanthropy, we have folks who are doing the research, we have folks who are the employers. A lot of different folks are involved in this conversation, and I don't think any of us would claim to have our heads completely around what's going on with AI. If you do, you're lying, right? And so it's really important to get together and have these conversations often and as in-depth as we can. I want to especially thank the sponsors who make our work possible and the ones who sponsored this event series, starting with our host, Don, and the James Irvine Foundation. Also thanks to San Jose Clean Energy, California Forward, Lyft, Marin Clean Energy, the League of California Cities, CSAC, the State Association of Counties, and last but definitely not least, the Sierra Health Foundation. Great to have you folks here with us in person. We're going to start with our first panel. We'll do the first panel, then we'll take a lunch break, do an interview with somebody who's got some fascinating takes on AI, and then this second panel. We are here for you to engage in this conversation. We will take your questions as best we can. We will be around afterwards as well to talk and over lunch. But let's get started. I want to introduce a superstar Bay Area journalist and reporter who's covering a lot of California economy and workforce issues for us. Here's the secret. There's no beat at CalMatters that doesn't touch AI, right? Obviously, or there's nothing in our lives that AI doesn't touch. So a lot of our folks are doing things in one way or another. But Levi Sumigesai is specifically focused on the California economy and how we make California work. And she's going to come up here 10 seconds after getting here, thanks to the Bay Bridge, right on time, and introduce the first panel and get us started. Welcome.
Thank you, Neil. I would like to call up Annette Bernhardt and Catherine Bracey up here. I do want to say that our third panelist, Brian Merchant, is flying in from LA, so he's due in any second. But I do want to start by saying, I have been at CalMatters for almost 2 years covering the economy, but I want to specifically mention that before that, I spent the bulk of my career at the Mercury News, which is the newspaper of Silicon Valley. I was there for over 2 decades. And over those 2 decades, I was either an editor or reporter of technology news. And so I have watched what technology has done, how it has changed everything, including the region in which we live, and how it's changed the nature of work, right? And so when I was asked to moderate this panel, I don't know why I'm standing. I guess I'm waiting for Brian to get here. So when I was asked to moderate this panel, I knew right away the organizations and people that I wanted to be on the panel. So first of all, I wanted Tech Equity to be here. And so I am very grateful that Catherine, its CEO, is able to be here today. Thank you, Catherine. And then I, in the course of my work, have bugged the UC Berkeley Labor Center time and time again. And so, Annette, thank you for being here. And hopefully Brian gets here soon. I'm a big fan of his work. He used to be the technology columnist at the LA Times and is now an independent journalist. He's flying up from LA to be here on this panel. And he literally wrote a book about the effects of technology on work. It's called Blood in the Machine. So with that, and while we wait for Brian, why don't I let Catherine and Annette introduce themselves and the work that you do. Thank you.
Is this working? Yes. Hi, everybody. My name is Annette Bernhardt. I direct the Technology and Work program at the UC Berkeley Labor Center. We conduct research on new and emerging technologies in the workplace. We also help, we support advocates in developing policy solutions, which I know we'll talk about today. And then we also do a lot of education and training because all of us, I think, are still trying to figure out this landscape of what are the technologies, how are they working, how are they impacting workers. And so building a shared base of knowledge among all of us, I think, is another really important thing that we do.
Thanks, Annette.
I'm Catherine Bracey. I'm the founder and CEO of Tech Equity. We are a California-based organization that's working on issues at the intersection of tech and economic equity, and we do research and advocacy on those issues. with a specific focus on housing and labor, two pretty critical issues in California, but also two critical areas where AI is having a huge influence. And we are anchoring a coalition of organizations from across the state that represent communities that are affected by AI and whose voices need to be heard in the conversation about how to regulate it, so that the laws are not written by and for industry alone. So I'm happy to do that in partnership with groups like the Labor Center and the California Labor Federation and many other groups who are represented here and I hope in the Zoom.
All right. So good morning to you all. Good morning to the very many people who are also watching this online. So today we'll be talking mostly about how AI and automation have affected low-wage jobs, but we know that AI is affecting jobs, period, right? So we'll be also touching on the effect on all jobs. And hopefully at the sort of the second half of the conversation, we should talk solutions and what you guys see as working, maybe what's not working, and the role that policymakers, entrepreneurs, and the AI industry play in all of this. So, all right. Let's start with this. There is going to be a big AI conference in San Francisco in September. I've been getting tons of emails about it.
I wasn't invited.
But many big and well-known companies in the AI space will be there. And the words that are being used to describe AI's effect in different industries include transforming, reshaping, optimizing, enhancing. So let's talk about that. Let's talk about the language that's used around AI, basically how it's being described, sold, advertised, and what that means for workers and the public. So I'll let each of you share your thoughts about that.
Can I throw another one into the mix, which I heard read this morning from one of the newer executives at OpenAI, which is empowering, which blew my hair back a little bit. I think it's interesting. I've been thinking a lot about what it means that the industry is adopting the language of the advocates who are pushing back on them to describe what it is they do. And just before I read that essay, I was reading about, and this is probably something that Brian could speak more to when he's here, but a labor movement slogan from the early 20th century, 8 hours for work, 8 hours for rest, and 8 hours for what you will. And I thought that phrasing, what you will, was really interesting for a couple of reasons. One is, they didn't say play or leisure or anything else. It was self-deterministic. It was about control and agency and self-determination. And I think that's a really important element to keep in mind here about the role that AI plays, not just in work, but in our lives. That agency really is the critical aspect of whether these tools are being used by you or on you. And the second thing I thought was really interesting was this idea that it wasn't just about the 8 hours of work. It was about the full 24 hours in a worker's day. And of course, a worker is a human being first and foremost. And the idea that the labor movement at that time, which was wildly successful, I would say, was using a message that was holistic is really important. And so I think when we talk about what does AI mean for workers, we need to also think about what that larger context is and not just focus on like the narrow sort of economic labor market aspects of that, but what this means for human dignity and life and liberty and freedom. And that for us, as we talk about how do we win the political war here, thinking about how we really make this salient to people, not just in these sort of technical aspects of their lives or really narrow policy prescriptions of certain use cases of AI, but what it means for the future of humanity is super important to this conversation. Hi, Brian.
Hi, Brian. I said some really nice things about you before you got here, but I don't want to let it go to your head, so you'll just have to watch the recording later. But we are talking about the language that's being used around AI right now. Things like transforming, reshaping, optimizing, enhancing. And what was the other one, Kathy?
Well, this is, I think, a co-optation of our language, which, now talking about how AI is empowering people.
Empowering, right. So Catherine just finished talking about what she thinks about that. Annette's going to go next. And, I know you just got here, but if you have some thoughts, that would be great.
I was going to say what Catherine said, so Brian, why don't you go ahead?
What if I was going to say what Catherine said too? It sounded pretty good to me. I mean, it's just a mess. I think it's to the point of meaninglessness, really. I mean, when I encountered this a lot when I kind of published the book, which was called Blood and the Machine. I don't know if you mentioned it, but it's about labor and automation. And so when that book came out, I toured around and I actually went to a number of tech companies, and some of which at the beginning of the sort of the AI boom engendered by ChatGPT were saying, okay, we're going to really try to do this right. Especially a company like Microsoft that had these deals or agreements with unions, and they were using all this language. And I talked to a lot of the sort of the folks and on the policy side who were, I think quite earnestly trying to look into how to do this the best way. And it was just brimming with language like this, like, well, we're going to empower workers and we're going to make sure that workers have a seat at the table. And that that they're going to get input. I think it really input was one that I heard a lot too. We got to give workers input, and substantively, when I would try to kind of drill down to what was actually going on here in terms of a contract or in terms of workplace policy or rights, there was very, very, very little there. And I think today that's only eroded, and there's even less there. So you hear a lot about this language, and AI is supposed to benefit all of humanity. AGI is supposed to benefit all of humanity, and it's supposed to, implicit is it's going to benefit workers. Well, it's really, I think, the most onerous of them all, because we're going to benefit all of humanity, but we're really talking about mass job automation software that is explicitly seeking to replace a lot of that labor, or at least that's a sales pitch.
That is a perfect segue for my next question. So over the summer, my teenage daughter applied to Chipotle, and I still have access to her emails for now. And she got an automated response from someone named Avocado. That is not a person. It's the company's AI hiring platform, right? So I Googled it and found that Chipotle CEO Scott Boatwright told Fortune, "This not only helps us keep our restaurant staffed, but ensures we have the best talent that's available in the industry. The hiring speed could help Chipotle open more than 300 locations this year, a new one almost every 24 hours, he said." So, AI is being used to hire people, but also, importantly, not to hire people, because my daughter is not working at Chipotle right now. So it truly begins at the start of the process, right? So can we talk about the implications of that first? Who would like to jump in here?
You mean the hiring part in particular? I mean, sure, although, I want to say, just to take one step back here, what we are talking about is employers increasingly using electronic monitoring, algorithmic management, job automation to impact a wide range of decisions. And hiring is just the very tip of the iceberg, and goes all the way through hiring to management to training to deciding who gets promoted, who doesn't, to setting wages, to deciding who gets part-time, who gets full-time, to what workers' schedules are, who gets disciplined, who doesn't, who gets fired, who is promoted into career ladder jobs and who is stuck in frontline jobs. So I think we need to understand this as a holistic set of systems that impact all of these decisions. And just to say, you know, in hiring and in hiring software in particular, there's been a lot of focus on discriminatory outcomes. And if you automate these systems, they're often trained on highly biased data sets. So the classic example is, I have a piece of hiring software. I want to train it who to look for. I'm going to train it on my workforce, which is largely white men. And their characteristics, and therefore my model learns, here are the characteristics of largely white men. And then when the hiring system looks at the resumes, is, surprise, surprise, largely selecting white men. There's lots of other concerns about hiring software, people with disabilities, being able to access it, et cetera. But I do want to step back and say, you know, at stake here is that we're basically, and I think this is the goal of the people who are making, partly the goal of people who are making these systems, is to automate what are profoundly consequential decisions for workers, and to fully automate them, and basically automating the HR department. And I think we really have to think hard about whether that's what we want as a society. It means workers have no insight into why they got hired or why they got fired. It means they have no redress to challenge that decision. And so to me, this is one of the sort of prime examples of where you talked about that, you know, AI is being developed sort of in the big search for AGI. This kind of optimization, is this really what we want for workers? Is this really how we want to run our workplaces? Is this how we want to run our societies? Is this how we want to run housing algorithms, right? This type of very narrow optimization, I think, is highly problematic. And so I would urge us to really step back and ask the sort of fundamental question, to what end? And what is the goal here?
Yeah, and I couldn't agree more. I think that it gets at these core questions, I think, that arise a lot if you sort of follow the implications of an AI or AI deployment down the rabbit hole. And it's kind of ultimately, you know, what for, right? Like, why do we want the person that's hiring the staff of a restaurant to be AI? Like, why to save, you know, a few tens of thousands of dollars on a salary per recruiter, per hirer? Is it worth that cost saving? I mean, it's also, you know, potentially an accountability sink, so that if, you know, whoever they hire, the firm isn't net responsible, they can point to the AI as, you know, the algorithm messed up, not the hirer. So there's added benefits like that. But I think in general, yeah, it just kind of corrodes these institutions, right? Like, these workers don't have an entry point into, you know, feeling, I mean, already we've undergone, you know, generations of sort of corrosion of where we walk into a restaurant and the people working there may or may not have ties to the community or the people coming in. It's been very corporatized, and, you know, AI, I think, in a lot of ways just accelerates these trends where, you know, workers don't even talk to a real person to hire them into the institution where they're going to be working. Whether or not they keep the job is determined by algorithmic variables that are not always visible to them. And so we further kind of erode these social bonds that used to govern workplaces and govern work. And from where I'm sitting, in exchange, you get very little, even monetary benefit. So we have to, I think Annette is completely right to ask why, what for, you know, why are we doing this? And is this in general, you know, a direction that we want to be heading or endorsing?
Catherine, do you want to weigh in?
Well, I actually have been thinking about this new study that just came out, that ChatGPT, if a woman asks it how much they should ask for in a job negotiation, it says like significantly less than if a man asks. And so, you know, to your point about just like how these things are sort of data in, data out, you know, we should be very critical about what they're trained on, and we have to know. There has to be some transparency. I mean, I think, you know, to this question of what is it for, I don't know that it's necessarily a bad thing. I think it's a valid, you know, answer to that question is because it makes it cheaper to fill all the jobs we need to fill, and we can fill them faster. And then the question becomes, okay, if that's the end, how do we serve these other ends that we have to serve as well? And that's the thing that, like, if you can see how these tools are working, if workers and people who are hired understand why the decision was made about them, or why their wages were set the way they were, and they have, you know, a seat at the table and how they're designed in the first place, then maybe these pressures are less intense. But so those are sort of the fundamentals. Not the tools themselves necessarily that are the problem. In some cases, there are technical aspects that need to be addressed. It's more about the context into which they're deployed, and the financial incentive structure that's wrapped around them. And I didn't say at the beginning, but I also wrote a book. High five, Brian. Yeah.
Sorry about that, Catherine.
We're all authors up here. About venture capital. It's called World Eaters. And the reason I wrote it is because spending all this time doing advocacy around these specific issues, it occurred to me that, the layer of technology, where technology actually hits the ground, is not necessarily the right place to be talking about regulation all the time, when the technology itself only has value because of the business model that's wrapped around it, or the financial incentive structures that are wrapped around it. So I really think it's important when we're thinking about, like, where and how these tools are deployed, that we're thinking about who, not just what are they for, but who is benefiting from them, who benefits from that actual use case of the tool, and what is the upstream financial pressure on those tools to act in that particular way. And I think if we are taking that holistic view of the technology, then it makes it easier to think about how you might interrupt or send the stream of how this technology develops into a way that is more beneficial for humanity.
Thank you.
Yeah, to that point, I would just add quickly that I doubt Chipotle's interviewing C-suite executives with avocado, right? I think there's a very particular sort of use case, and I think that Chipotle probably feels is appropriate to deploy this kind of recruiting tool, and that's worth thinking about too.
The C-suite folks may be interviewed by someone named Guac Omoli. Sorry. Okay. So okay, let's talk about once, you talk a little bit about how avocado sort of replaces HR, right? So once workers are hired, some of them don't even have human bosses, right? This is called algorithmic management. And it is used in the app-based gig economy, something I've covered for a while, and is one of the reasons I admire Brian Merchant so much, is because I would, when I was covering the gig economy, so was he, and I was reading his work and thinking, God, I wish I wrote that story. So Brian, you wrote a book called Blood in the Machine. It is about the Industrial Revolution, how cloth workers dealt with machines and automation that took away their jobs, how the Luddites fought for their rights, how they were driven into poverty, lost their livelihoods, and in some cases, their lives, right? You wrote that algorithm-based gig work is the next stage in the evolution of the factory, that the gig work model has reduced the need for middle management, and it helps determine the working conditions of drivers and delivery workers. So let's talk about gig work and sort of the creep of the gig economy business model into other industries and other occupations. What are you most worried about that?
Yeah, I mean, it is already creeping into all kinds of different industries. I think most maybe worrying into healthcare, into nursing. There's been recent studies and looks at sort of the precaritization of healthcare workers and how even roles as sort of crucial as nurses are sort of being subject to increasingly to algorithmic management, and there's just a lot of problems with this, just a universe of problems with this. HR is already often sort of a poor replacement for actual worker empowerment, but at least there's a recourse, at least there's somebody to speak to. Now a lot of these workers have have algorithms that sort of dictate where and how they work, and if something goes wrong, they can send a complaint into a bottomless,
In
the app, right? To the faceless organization that may or may not respond. Often this is in response to very pressing needs, like if they've been deactivated and they can no longer work or earn on their and earn a livelihood, but they may depend on this. Many workers do depend on gig apps to work, as we know, and so the options for recourse are vanishingly small, and it's opacity, right? Like it's so difficult to tell who's being assigned a job and why, and this has given rise to what scholar Vina Dubal, who's great, shout out to Vina, who's been instrumental in giving sort of some sunlight to all of these issues. Algorithmic discrimination, right? We don't know a lot of times, if a certain kind of person is being given, lower rates, or if they certainly have the data profiles on and then the demographic information on its users and its workers, and there's all kinds of abuses that can and have been shown to happen in these systems. So that's the fear, that we have these opaque, unaccountable systems expanding, and we've recently seen some efforts at legislation, I think, to rein some of this in, because now it's getting to the point where it's unignorable, where we have surge pricing for groceries and this constellation of algorithmically sort of determined prices and wages is expanding to a point where it's unignorable anymore. But I think it's a huge issue.
Yeah, a couple of additional thoughts. So one thing I want to make sure that we are not losing the role of the employer here. And so the majority of employers are not completely automating all of their decisions using these systems. And I think that's really important, both substantively, because employer choice about how to deploy these systems is a really big factor. And when we get to talking about solutions, that actually is the target of a lot of legislation. And it also complicates sort of how do we regulate this stuff if it's not completely wired in the tech itself yet. And an example of this is a very famous example from scheduling, automated scheduling software, which takes foot traffic like in a retail store and automates the scheduling. Well, you can optimize that just to optimize it by foot traffic, and then you get these awful schedules where people are like staying until midnight and then having to come in at 4 o'clock again. Or you can both optimize for both workers and their scheduling needs and the employer's needs. Now that is a decision, and it's often made by the employer, not by the designer. So I just want to bring back in that a lot of this, that employers have a lot of agency, and often they're using algorithmic tools not so much to substitute for the decisions, but to support them in their decisions. And more generally, another quick thing to say about algorithmic management is you don't only see it in gig worker context. You see it in regular W-2 jobs like Amazon warehouses, like call centers, like nurses in hospitals who are regular W-2 workers. And so it's not necessarily tied to precarious types of jobs. It does make the jobs more precarious. So I want to make sure we're widening the lens. And then in terms of impacts, if it's useful, I think it's really important to keep distinct like 2 buckets of impacts on workers. And of potentially negative impacts on workers. And I want to say here, I don't think, again, this tech is inherently bad. I don't think it's always impacting workers negatively. I do think, given that we have almost no regulation right now, the risk of negative impacts on workers is very, very high. But when we're talking about impacts, I think it's important to keep separate that there are impacts on workers that are really about exploitation. that are about, sort of low road employers using the tech to get more effort out of workers, using it to de-skill them, using it to make jobs more contingent, using it to surveil workers who are trying to organize a union. All of that falls in the box of exploitation. The second box is automation, because this tech often then can be used to either automate tasks or jobs. Those are two very different impacts that I think when it comes to the policy discussion, we also have to keep distinct in terms of how we're addressing them. And I think algorithmic management and more broadly this broad range of data-driven tools are potentially hitting on both fronts. And then the final piece is just because we were talking about low wage, we're trying to focus on low wage industries. Everybody, like you said, is in different ways starting to be impacted by this tech. But, I think all of us here are really concerned about low wage workers. Because when we look at where the most pernicious forms of experimentation with this tech have happened, it does look like it's happening disproportionately in low-wage industries. And I worry a lot that professional workers and unionized workers may have more of a way to fight back against some of these negative impacts. I worry a lot about the low-wage workers of color, low-wage women workers, low-wage immigrant workers, who really don't have any way to fight against basically being experimented upon with this tech. I think I hate to call out one company, but I do think like the Amazon warehouse example is an example where a company has been over time experimenting with different versions of tech, how to get more productivity out of their workers.
That's exactly what I was going to ask you next, actually, because I have been in an Amazon warehouse and seen, the little robots that take the packages everywhere, and have seen how workers are essentially stuck for hours doing the same exact thing. I mean, it's a factory. It's a warehouse and a factory. So I was going to ask about the work that the UC Berkeley Labor Center has done around electronic surveillance, how yes, Amazon keeps track of every single minute of the workers in those warehouses, even their bathroom breaks. And so can you talk a little bit about that? I know you just did, but maybe just a little bit more about those warehouse workers. We know them. We depend on them. And yes, we are concerned about what happens. And also I might say also that Amazon has, Amazon workers have tried to unionize, but Amazon has been fighting them for years. I've written about it.
You have? Yeah, no, you've done a really great reporting on it. And you all should totally jump in too. But yeah, so basically the idea is, one thing I want to emphasize, it's hard, you can't separate out electronic monitoring from algorithmic management. These things are all in systems. Employers are using systems, not individual technologies. And so there's intense surveillance, often via sensors attached to workers about every move that workers make. This then goes into a big database. Workers are continuously ranked on how productive they are. Often there's a leaderboard up on the screen where workers are basically being forced to compete with one another about who's moving packages the fastest. There's an algorithmic system that's also continuously analyzing productivity rates, setting quotas. So it's a fully integrated system. And what I would say is the reason I think that this example has become sort of the poster child is it really exemplifies, in my mind, the dystopian endpoint here is that is not so much that we're automating jobs, but that we're automating humans. That basically in these types of systems, humans become basically fleshy machines that the algorithms are moving around on the shop floor. And that sounds extreme, but I do think warehouses are an example of that. But I'm also, I know you've written on them, and I know you guys have studied as well, so.
I mean, I would just say, I think there's 100% chance that the data from those sensors is going to train robot replacements. I mean, just because it's not possible now doesn't mean that's not on the roadmap. So I do think there's a path here towards full automation. And I just say two things. One is just everything you described there, I think for most people, you'd hear that and think that sounds very dystopian and awful, and it has nothing to do with actually the economics of the job, right? Like we didn't talk about how much they get paid or what their benefits are or whatever. And that goes back to my point that I was making earlier, that this is not about economics and, you know, kind of like the political conversation around affordability or whatever. It's about human dignity. And, you know, this is just, I mean, free political advice for any politicians who might be listening. You know, I understand that it is very important to be seen in this political environment to be really authentically fighting about or holding, you know, speaking about affordability. But I think if you're doing that in the absence of this like human agency, I think there was, you know, in the 2024 election, there was all this talk about, well, the economy's doing so well, the unemployment rate is so low, actually wages are up, you know, there's certain groups who are doing better than they ever have. Like, why is everybody still so mad? And this vibe session idea, it's because of things like this. They feel undermined, they feel like they can't, you know, they're not in control of their own destiny. And it's not necessarily about the money. I mean, yes, affordability is a piece of that, but it's also about human dignity. If you're not able to connect those two things, I think it's really hard to make a salient political argument. And I forgot the second thing I was going to say about this, but
yeah, just briefly, the dehumanization is at the core of this, right? And so nurses, algorithms now dictating patient care, and nurses not having the right to override it. When you're on the phone with a call center worker, there's literally an automated system in the ear of the call center worker coaching them, saying, you're not showing enough emotion, show more emotion, right? This is the core of it is the autonomy, human dignity. And I think that is actually, in the end, what we need to address, and this gets us to a discussion of how to make sure workers are at the table.
Catherine, actually, I was going to ask you, I know that Tech Equity has done work around tiered workforces also. When I think back to my reporting, I think about talking with Google employees who weren't exactly Google employees because they were contract workers. And in some cases, they were doing some of the same work that the highly paid Google engineers were doing, but making much less money and not having access to certain tools that they needed to do their jobs.
Yeah, I mean, I think it
does. Can you talk about that a little?
Yeah, and speaks to the human dignity part of just how they were treated sort of as second class. And Google calls them temps, vendors, and contractors, TVCs. But these are basically workers that are hired through third parties to fill roles that are core to the actual business of tech companies, not just Google. I think it's happening across the industry. This is actually one of the first areas where I started thinking about the role of venture capital, because you know, the venture incentive structure is driving the decision. Like it values companies more highly when there are fewer workers. And Reid Hoffman, who is a prolific venture capitalist and startup founder, wrote a book called Blitzscaling, which is a very popular playbook for entrepreneurs. And in it, he talks about the need to, like, in order to grow fast, in order to become the sort of size that a startup needs to become to fulfill the mandate that investors are driving in terms of their returns, they have to you know, hire as few people as possible. And he refers to workers in that book as growth limiters. And I think that mindset really flavors how venture-backed companies think about workers. And it is now not just, and so that led to this practice of like, well, actually, we can just offboard the responsibilities of employing these workers to others, and also it will look like our headcount is lower and our market cap is higher, and that ratio looks really good to investors. And just like kind of hide the responsibility for those workers in this sort of very opaque network. That has sort of morphed, and we got into that work as part of like working on the gig worker stuff. There's a lot of talk about gig workers. There wasn't a lot of talk about these TVCs, and we thought, you know, it was worth shining a light on that practice. That's now morphed now in the AI era to platform work. So the offshoring of jobs that are critical to building AI systems, training the tools, telling it like, no, that's not a dog, that's a cat, or, you know, like how do you think the Waymos know where they're going? Like there's a lot of human vision behind that AI vision. It's a lot of people in places like the Philippines or Kenya or wherever that are training the systems, and they are working in pretty abysmal conditions. And so I think that's, and now there are companies that are starting to do that further up the sort of value chain. We're talking about engineers at Amazon who are now saying, I feel like actually a warehouse worker. Like my job has become, sort of not automated, but augmented in a way that is as sort of dehumanizing, and like that degrades all work. And this is the thing I was going to say earlier is like, I know we're focused on lower wage workers, but like today's white collar, higher wage workers are tomorrow's lower wage workers. And I think it's really important for us, again, to think about this holistically, what it means for the entire labor force, what it means for lower wage workers today if higher wage workers are losing their jobs or being pushed down the ladder. And for us, from a policy perspective, what does that mean for how we think about policy solutions?
Right, exactly. So before we turn to talking about solutions, I did want to ask Brian, you recently put out a call asking people, have you lost your job to AI? And the response has been crazy. I read the first thing you wrote about it. You talked about tech workers, the very people who created AI, losing their jobs to AI. Can you talk about this? And also, I know you haven't written about it yet, but can you give us a little peek into sort of what percentage of the responses were people in sort of low wage work versus, I don't know, white collar work?
Yeah, so just a tiny clarification, and is that I kind of purposefully kind of opened it up to, I'm calling this project AI Killed My Job. So it encompasses people who feel like not only they've lost their jobs to a manager who's now using AI, or had their department erased wholesale, but also just feels like it's impacted their working life in a serious way, and has killed what they love about their job, or parts of what they love about their job. And so I would say I hear from that latter category the most so far. People.
Which latter category?
That AI is being, or managers are using AI, and I also have to make that distinction that it's, and I know I walked this sort of tightrope when I called it AI Killed My Job, but in giving AI as a force too much agency, it's always a manager who's using AI in a particular context or a way that bears the full brunt of responsibility for this job changing. So I want to make that clear. And that is, more often I'm hearing from people who are saying, my boss has said, everybody has to attend this AI training. You have to demonstrate how you're using it this way, or they've just introduced this AI tool that's showing up in the workplace and we have no say over it. I'm in the case of the tech workers. One of the most interesting stories I got was from a Google software engineer, a senior software engineer, who said, I'm just watching junior staffers feed AI-generated code into crucial digital infrastructure with very little oversight. And it's creating potentially systemic problems because there's too much volume of this AI-generated stuff for quality assurance teams to catch. And that going forward, if this practice is entrenched and sort of accelerated, then it could lead to any number of problems, not just for workers who have to deal with it later, but for everybody who use these very important digital systems. I have heard from people who are in that sort of first category, who said, whether or not the AI has been, deployed in such a way that it can successfully carry out all the tasks that I used to do, management took the opportunity to fire us, to let me go. That was the case of Dropbox, which saw a reduction in force that was pretty large, and it was justified by the company going AI first. I heard from folks from CrowdStrike, who, very similar case, where we've laid off hundreds of people. I think it was maybe 10%, 20% of the workforce, as part of a shift to AI. And of course, the more publicized and very, I guess those were publicized too, but Duolingo and Klarna have famously very sort of openly embrace this. And then hearing from workers on the other end has been really, really illuminating. And sometimes it is just, they're going to try. They're going to try to replace me with this AI. The Duolingo writer who I spoke with after the company announced this AI first strategy and said, we're going to start severing ties with contractors and replacing it with AI generated content. And she said, they already did it. We've been training the AI for years with our materials and feeding it into the system, and we're contract workers, also important. They're much more vulnerable to this sort of replacement and much more likely to be let go completely. And people doing creative work that doesn't have to be as reliable as like that code going into Google's infrastructure. And so I've heard from a lot of people of that end of the spectrum, and just probably hundreds of people who have or are forced to deal with AI in some way in their workplace. That it's journalists who, I just talked to journalists at Politico who are arbitrating a dispute with management because they have a union contract that says you can't just use AI however you want. You have to bring it to the newsroom 60 days in advance and we'll talk about it. But during the DNC coverage and during the VP debate last year, plop, there was an AI tool that was just summarizing what people were saying and violating editorial guidelines of the newsroom openly. And posts were just deleted without corrections. Editors were just having to sort of keep up with it. And this was a very top-down management-led effort. And so journalists are, saying, hey, this is ruining our reputation. This is taking my work and distorting it and making me look bad. It's also perhaps a labor automation issue, because if you have more of these tools, that window that it occupied used to go to journalists' written work and reporting. So that's just one very, very recent example. But yeah, it runs the gamut, and depending on the work category, there is actually, I think, a little bit more displacement going on among freelancers and creative workers, writers, illustrators, copywriters, designers that maybe don't always show up as obviously in sort of the near-term economic data. I've heard enough anecdotes from people who have said, hey, I was an illustrator with a full portfolio of clients until last year, and now that corporation that used to hire me to design their internal presentations is just using Midjourney.
Yeah. Catherine, in your book, see, I did mention
Thank you. Thanks.
in
World
your book,
Eaters,
World Eaters,
available at bookstores everywhere.
about venture capital and its effects on business and technology. You talked about starting tech equity as a way to engage the tech industry to be better corporate citizens. So, considering what Brian just talked about, tech workers literally losing their jobs, or because of some of the tech that they may have had a hand in building. Are you seeing more recognition on the part of the tech industry workers about the sort of the ethical concerns and the effects on their own work that what they're working on is has wrought?
Also, that's so funny. You said better corporate citizens. Is that what? Oh my God, I was such a sweet summer child back in 2015. Wow, a different era. Yeah, times have changed. I mean, we at the time, we actually, to be fair, found out pretty quickly that companies didn't really have much of an interest in changing their practices in any meaningful way, and so we did pivot to organizing tech workers pretty soon after that. And really helping them understand their political power in this region, in this state, and how they should use it to make sure that the growth of the tech industry was benefiting everybody. And there was a lot of interest and energy around that. It has evolved in part because of COVID and people going to remote work, but also just because the technology is evolving, that we started focusing more on the products and practices that companies were, using to sort of influence the economy for everybody. And workers, if we were trying to organize them around something that really wasn't in their own personal self-interest, but it was to lend their power to show up as allies for gig workers or whoever, it has now really come home for them. And I think the conversation we've just been having is pretty clear about that. Like, I don't think they really understood that when they were building these tools, they were building their replacements. And the fact that these are the first jobs that are being fully automated is pretty sobering. And so we're hearing from a lot of workers in the AI industry in particular who are like, whoa, this is, first of all, not what I signed up for to create. I think, folks at OpenAI are very concerned about this governance shift that is happening, and they're starting to ask questions like that. Workers, they're starting to see themselves as workers in a way that I think they really thought of themselves as sort of equity stakeholders in these companies, which they were to some extent, but that is also starting to fall apart in some pretty important ways. So actually, I think that's a really good development. I think it's a really healthy development for these workers to understand their role in the system, and not just their lack of power, but the power that they could have collectively and in solidarity with other workers to help influence how these systems develop. So yes, we are seeing a lot of that.
Interesting. So let's turn to solutions. Let's talk about legislation, policies, solutions that you guys are seeing that are working or not working. This week, I'll be publishing a story about legislation AB 1340 in California, which would give Uber and Lyft drivers the right to unionize in California, despite the fact that Prop 22 cemented their place as independent contractors in the state. So that's one piece of legislation that's trying to sort of deal with the effects of algorithmic management and what all that entails. If California passes that legislation, it would be second to Massachusetts, which in November there was a ballot initiative there that was passed that is going to do the same thing, which is let Uber and Lyft drivers organize. So that's one thing. What else are you guys thinking about seeing as positive solutions?
Yeah.
I'm just going to say real quick to throw it to you that that the Berkeley Labor Center just compiled, one of your researchers, your colleagues compiled this wonderful database of all the different sort of ways that union contracts have engaged with technologies, things from addressing algorithmic management to putting limits on automation and AI. It's just a really wonderful resource. I haven't spent a ton of time with it yet, but I'm glad that it exists. So.
I'm very happy to report that to Lisa. I'm sure she'll be delighted that you're using it. Yeah, so, just to take a quick step back here, I believe strongly that we need rules of the road around this tech in the workplace. And right now, we have none. Like, workers don't have the right to know when their employer is monitoring them, what decisions the employer is making, which systems they're using, how it's impacting their working conditions. Workers don't have recourse. They don't have the right to challenge it. It is literally a blank slate. And so I know there's a lot of talk about, regulation inhibits innovation. The way I think about it is the U.S. regulates its labor markets. In the last century, we put down basic rules around the minimum wage, around health and safety standards. And I think of what we're doing right now as a very similar thing. We are trying to put down basic rules of the road and guardrails around one of the newest tools that employers are using. And so we can do that either via public policy or collective bargaining. At the Labor Center, we have both a really great sort of guide to tech and work public policy that you guys might be interested in. And then we have just released this amazing database of 175 collective bargaining agreements around tech. What I would say is the good news here is that worker advocates and unions such as the California Federation of Labor have been very active over the last couple of years in developing what are the types of protections that workers need and what are the types of rules we want to put into place for employers to make sure they're using the tech responsibly. This is actually like a really good news story, and in 2025 in particular, we are tracking 300 bills that have the potential to impact workers or that are sponsored by labor unions. So let me give you a quick flavor for some of the concepts. I can't do justice to everything that's out there, but this is the year when unions started introducing bills that broadly erect a broad framework around electronic monitoring and algorithmic management. And Sarah Flox and her team at the California Federation of Labor have been leaders in this, introducing a package of 3 bills that is really the first in the country to try to say, here are the transparency requirements, here are the basic guardrails we need in place. We see that in Vermont, in Massachusetts, and in Washington, and we expect more next year. And a very interesting trend we're seeing is bills that are basically saying a human has to be in command of tech. And we are seeing that in healthcare, we're seeing that in education, in law, in criminal justice. These bills vary how they articulate it, but I find it really interesting. And these are not all just coming from labor, they're coming from civil society. And we're really seeing this blossoming of a really robust discussion, like, who should be the teacher of my kid, right? And if I'm a patient, who should be deciding whether or not my insurance covers a given procedure? That is a very important, robust discussion. And this concept that a human has to be the one that is making the decision, or that is doing the teaching, or that is making a call on whether or not you get covered, or whether Medicaid, whether you're eligible for Medicaid, to me, that's a very big sort of new arrival on the scene. We are seeing bills to fight automation famously. There's an amazing one in New York State that the News Guild union just introduced, which basically is writing rules of the road, and among other things, saying you can't use AI to replace us as journalists. There's new concepts around surveillance pricing and wage setting, which has already been mentioned. And then the last category I would flag, which we haven't talked too much about, but is public sector AI. Because government itself uses a lot of these systems and has the potential to really impact us as the public, and also public sector workers. And so there we're seeing policymakers really grapple with what does it mean for the public sector to be the model adopter of tech. And really, I think, developing the idea that the public sector government should actually be held to a higher standard even than the private sector, in making sure that when they're using AI for benefits administration, it doesn't discriminate, for example, or is not penalizing low-income families. So those are some of the trends. And I would say this is just on what we call the deployer side. There's been a lot of activity, folks thinking about how should we and can we regulate the developers of the tech, the companies that are actually making the tech. And I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, I guess going back to the point about financial systems, I really believe strongly that we can affect, again, this is a powerful technology that could have a lot of benefits in the world. And the big tragedy for me is that the existing incentive structure is pushing towards the most exploitative use cases. And I believe that if we had a more diverse financial system that could fund companies that didn't need to be multi-billion-dollar companies in order to be worth investing in, that we could see a lot more better use cases that value and that don't need to exploit workers in order to make money for themselves or for their investors. And actually, California has launched a very little-known venture capital program in the state investment bank that many of you probably didn't even know existed. But I'm really interested to see in how, speaking to public sector use cases, how the state can deploy those funds in a way that incentivizes a different way of investing in innovation. I think if we could invest in an innovation ecosystem in California that didn't need to rely on exploitation and profit ultra maximization, we'd see a more robust economy, more sustainable and resilient economy, and we wouldn't always have this gun to our head from companies threatening to move to Texas because it's a race to the bottom. So I think that's a really important structural thing we can do. The other thing I want to mention is that OpenAI, I mentioned their governance change. They are trying to move from being a nonprofit to a for-profit. It's very wonky and technical. but it's a critical decision that is now on the plate of the Attorney General to decide whether he allows OpenAI to move forward with this conversion in the way that they are proposing to move forward. And I think we have an opportunity here to really plant a flag for government to say what is in the public interest and not allow OpenAI to just pull all of this value out of the nonprofit sector and run off and do whatever they want with it and to serve investor interests. I actually interviewed Sam Altman for my book before he got fired, and I have him on record, his voice saying how important it was for him to set up the OpenAI as a nonprofit because explicitly to protect the technology from investors and the incentives of investors. And now here we are. And that's very scary to me. And so I think it's really important for all of you who care about this issue to, maybe let the Attorney General or your local elected official know that it's important for the state of California to hold OpenAI to account for their initial commitment to their nonprofit mission.
Yeah, thanks for bringing that up, Catherine. A shout out to my colleague, Kari. He and I are going to work on this story.
Good.
For sure, because we've been following what's been going on with that. And Brian, since you flew all the way from LA, I want to give you the last word. What are you optimistic about?
Yeah, I think very little, but nonetheless, the most success that we've seen, the most immediate success for workers in sort of shaping AI policy as it interacts with their lives has been so far through collective bargaining agreements, has been unionizing. So organizing is the most immediate tool. It's the most important tool. It's not available to millions and millions of American workers because we have such low union density. It's so hard to get some unions started, and so many of the affected industries, as we've been talking about, are very precarious and atomized. That said, I think so far that we have sort of the gold standard of contracts as far as they concern AI, with like the WGA winning a protection that the studio cannot generate scripts.
It's the Writers Guild.
The Writers Guild, the Writers Guild of America West, yes. And that victory, I think, can still be looked at as providing an important bulwark. It doesn't say that no AI can be used at all. It just moves AI over into the writer's side of the labor process. They control it. If they want to use AI, they can. There's still a number of issues, with how it's used and whether or not, that's being adhered to by studios all the time. But it's a good example. There are other ones too. I just mentioned the Politico, the Penn Guild's contract, which management chose to steamroll, but at least they have recourse, right? Now it goes to arbitration. It's embarrassing for management. There's a workplace dispute ongoing. And I think there's a lot of hope there. And flowing from that, I think one reason that the Writers Guild was able to achieve that degree of success was when they started talking about protecting their jobs from AI and studios using AI, it resonated with everybody. There was a lot of solidarity out there, people saying, I don't want AI to come for my job either. And so workers recognizing that that solidarity exists, that there is space, that there is the capacity to push back against exploitative uses of AI, against overreach of AI, against intrusions of AI by management, I think is really is inspiring. It is one of the more hopeful frontiers. And I would end by noting that this is also a bipartisan issue to some extent. If we look at that effort where the GOP and Silicon Valley lobbyists recently pushed for this effort to install a moratorium on state-level AI lawmaking, which would have invalidated or complicated all of those policies we're talking about. Ultimately, the stick in the mud that prevented it from clearing the hurdle was not what was Marshall Blackburn, who was a Republican senator of Tennessee. And Tennessee has laws that protect country music artists and all music artists from having their voices replicated by AI. And people were saying, well, wait, does this new ban override this law in the books? And it was enough to sort of, I think, a lot, civil society was behind it. I know unions did a lot of organizing against seeing that amendment into the big, beautiful bill take root. But there was enough countervailing forces, enough sort of bipartisan support to prevent that onerous sort of overreach. a tough day when we're calling the failure of a moratorium on state lawmaking to pass a victory for democracy, but it is, and it does show, I think, to somewhat the breadth of support for the capacity and the desire for workers and for people to sort of rein AI in and make sure that workers benefit from AI too.
All right, and with that, I think this panel is the only thing standing in the way of lunch, so we're going to end it here. But I am so grateful. This was definitely the perfect 3 people to bring up here and talk about this. Thank you so much to each of you. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
And thank
Thanks
you,
for having
Levy.
us. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Annette, Catherine, Brian. Levy, great job, as always, doing this.
Thank you.
I will just mention at CalMatters, we negotiated our first union contract this year with Levy and Kari in the process. And that language you're talking about in New York was modeled on what the staff wrote for our contract at CalMatters. We've actually used AI to generate new jobs, which I'll be happy to talk about in more detail, but we created an AI product that analyzes, everything about our state legislators and generates story ideas that we and local reporters can then follow up on. And we hired, as part of that grant money we got for that, we put in positions to hire reporters to do more of that. I am actually the thing standing between you and lunch, so I will get out of the way. Lunch is being served in the back room there in the kitchen. Feel free to grab something, bring it out here. We're going to start the program up again very promptly at 12:15 for our online folks on Zoom who can take a break for half an hour, and for our guest who's joining us by Zoom exactly at 12:15. So please be ready to start back up then. Thanks.